It's nice to meet you. I'm Trina. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome back. I'm back with another monthly reading update. I really enjoy planning these and filming these videos because, especially with the months I've had recently, life's been very chaotic, and it's nice to go back and look at what books I've read throughout the month and put them in little categories and see, oh, I've been reading more of this genre than I thought, or that genre. So overall, I had a good time planning this one, and hopefully you have a good time watching. It was kind of a crazy month for me personally. I was downsizing my apartment and getting rid of a lot of stuff, and I was traveling, and therefore I don't have my books with me, so no longer can I hold up the majority of my books for these videos. But that all being said, I've now landed. I've had a good last couple of weeks. I'm getting into the Christmas spirit. I've been enjoying fall and the fall colors, so it's still been a good time, just busy. So I didn't read as many books this month. 6, 7, 8, 9. So I read 14 books total. Not bad, that's great. That's 6 books more than my goal for the month. I try to read 8 books a month. That's 6 books more than that, that's great. Some of them were rereads, which we'll get into. Some of them were for vlogs, so maybe I won't get into them as deeply. Overall, still a great reading month despite the chaos, I will say. Putting aside my chai, I can start out by talking about the audiobooks that I listened to this month. I don't necessarily walk as much this month as I normally do, so I didn't necessarily walk and listen like I usually have, but I did a lot more video gaming this month. I got back into Stardew Valley, and I've been really enjoying listening to audiobooks while playing Stardew Valley, so I've still gotten through 3 audiobooks. The first one is The Foundling and Other Tales of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. This is a collection of short stories from one of my favorite children's fantasy series that I listened to on audiobook last year, The Book of Three. I really loved that series, and I really recommend the audiobook. Love old school fantasy on audiobook, love having it read to me. And even though it's children's fantasy, it's like old school children's fantasy, you know? So I think old school children's fantasy tends to read a little bit older. I think it's suited for adults that want to read it as well. And also, my dad always loves to tell this story that the first time he ever listened to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was when he was growing up. He would listen to this Swedish children's radio show, and they would read a chapter of those books every month. And so he and his brother would get together around the radio and listen to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and that's how he read it for the first time. And whenever I listen to old school fantasy on audiobook, I always think about that, and it does give me that same sort of warm feeling like someone's telling a story around a campfire. Overall, this was just a little collection of short stories from that world that I've been waiting for my library to get for a year. I finally got it, checked it out, listened to it, loved it, gave it 4 stars. It is not really a freestanding story because it's a bunch of little stories, but I still had a good time with it. And I don't think I can think of a single story in the collection that I disliked overall. I loved them all. I think my favorites were the more fable-like ones. They all kind of were fables, honestly. There was one with wizards trying to win over a witch princess, and the first 2 are too braggery and show off too much with their magic, versus the last one is a very kind and very nice man, but then it turns out he's not actually a wizard, but she's allowed to marry him anyways because she's in love with him because he's won her real heart and not just shown that he can do witchcraft. So I thought that was a cute story, and there are other fable-like stories in it that I just had a good time with. I recommend the book series as well, but when you're finished reading the book series, if you've read it before or if you're going to read it, then I would also recommend reading these short stories with it because it just is more of Lloyd Alexander's warm feeling writing. And then the second audiobook I listened to this month was The Wager by David Grann. Off the bat, I can tell you I wasn't the biggest fan of this audiobook. I just felt like listening to it, I'm thinking back now, it's not a super surprising story. I can tell you it's a nonfiction book about a shipwreck that occurred in the early 1700s, I believe, a British shipwreck of a ship called the Wager that was on its way with a group of other ships to surprise the Spanish in one of the Spanish-English wars that they were currently in the middle of. And the shipwreck story pretty much goes exactly the way you would expect it to. People get sick because they don't have enough medical resources in those times. People get scurvy, people die, people get thrown overboard. Then they land on this island and there's some mutinies occurring. There's people who don't agree with the captain. There's people who are loyal to the captain. It's just, if someone told me to describe, what do you think a British shipwreck in the 1700s would be like? I could have written this book. Like, it just didn't feel like it was a story particularly worth writing a book about. And maybe that's hater energy, sorry. But I felt like it would have made a great 1-hour podcast episode and like a history podcast. But it didn't need to be like a 7-hour book, and it wasn't particularly grasping because there was nothing in it that was like intriguing, especially to myself. I think the only highlight was the audiobook narrator. He was really trying to make it work, and he really told it like it was a tale worth telling, but it didn't fully make up for the content for me. I ended up giving this 2 stars, 2.5 stars. Yeah, I ended up giving this 2.5 stars. It also might have been my fault. I was in the midst of moving hecticity the week I was listening to this book, and I was listening to a lot of it when I was like walking to drop off stuff in little neighborhood libraries and pantries and carrying stuff to Goodwill. And I wanted something that would really like take me away from my current stress and like help me escape a little bit. And it just wasn't that book. It didn't feel that way. It didn't give those vibes, unfortunately. Although I love a nonfiction audiobook, to be clear, I love a nonfiction audiobook. I wouldn't recommend this one. Maybe it's better in the book. And if you're a history person, you'll like it. I was saying when I wrote my review, the only positive for this book was that I learned a bunch of great terminology about captaincy and ships in Britain in this time period, which will help me understand persuasion more on my next reread because the love interest there is a ship's captain. Other than that, I feel like for like the casual nonfiction reader, this is one you can skip. You're not gonna get very much out of it. And then the last audiobook that I read this month, or listened to this month, was The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. This is book 2 in a YA fantasy series that is about a girl, Evangeline, who gets her heart broken, and she travels to away from her country to a place called the Magnificent North and gets herself entangled in a prophecy. And involved in the prophecy is this like mean boy love interest called Jax, who's super blonde and super bitchy. I knew what I was getting myself into with these books. I read book 1, obviously, and it wasn't for me. It reads a lot younger than I tend to prefer with fantasy, not just in the writing. The writing was fine. The writing's kind of beautiful at some points. The character writing reads very young. The characters are very immature. They don't really act like the adults they're supposed to be, or the immortals that they're supposed to be, which always bugs me in these kinds of books. Like, YA immortals tend to be frustrating characters to read. And Evangeline, the main character, her thought processes are so ridiculous at times. Like, it feels like you're watching Dora the Explorer, and Dora's going like, should we go to the forest? It's a dangerous forest. What do you think? Should we go? That's what it feels like reading Evangeline's head. And I'm like, this is not how normal people think and make decisions and respond. And they're not so like overcome with the hotness of this man that they, maybe some people are. I just don't particularly like reading characters like that all the time. That being said, it's been 4 months since I read book 1, and I was kind of feeling like I wanted a silly little audiobook. After reading The Wager, I was like, I want a silly little fantasy audiobook, if we're being honest, with characters doing predictable character things and a storyline that's not gonna shock me or like have me horrified while playing Stardew Valley. Something like quick that I can put on at 1.5 speed while playing my games. And I did kind of want to continue this series, low-key. I kind of want to know what happens. So props to Stephanie Garber, even for a person who these books are clearly not written for, she can still weave a yarn, and I liked it. And I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I actually think I liked it better than the first book because I didn't come in with such high expectations. I came into the first book with much higher expectations, and I was disappointed. I think I gave it like 3 stars or something like that, 2.5. This book, I came in with the expectation of what it was, and it was what it was. Overall. In editing hindsight, I dropped it another half star because I really, really hate Jax and Evangeline's relationship. And now that I know how these characters think and act, I wasn't particularly shocked, but oh my god, there were points I was like, if I did a drinking contest where I took a shot every single time Evangeline gets pulled up against a hot man's chest and he pulls her to his chest, I probably would have been dead after the first 10 chapters. She gets pulled into people's chests way too often. This poor girl gets tossed about. But you know what? She likes it, and that's all that really matters. It doesn't matter if I don't like it, because she likes it. And I think also listening to it while playing a game was enough mental distraction that it actually really worked for me. So overall, I had an enjoyable time reading this book, and I definitely think there are some people that I would recommend it to, particularly if you like YA fantasy romance. I would recommend them. But if you know you don't like YA, or you know that sometimes YA bothers you, but you only read like some YA, then this probably isn't for you either, because it does read on the younger side of YA, despite all the hot men. But yeah. And then the next category, I read 3 romance books, specifically throughout the month, kind of, but I'll group them all together. Starting off in the beginning of the month, kind of at the end of October, going into the beginning of November, I read The People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. This was my first Emily Henry book, and it's been a little bit since I read this, and I was looking back, I was like, I gave this 4 stars. I don't think it was 4 stars, but I did give it 4 stars when I finished it, and at 4 stars, it will stay. Probably largely because I ended up reading like 70% of it on the day after election day. I wanted something light and fluffy. I'd been working really hard up to the election and was really stressed out. So the day after, I kind of just sat, watched The Sound of Music, and read this entire book. And it was perfect for that. I do recommend this book in times of crisis. I think overall what kept it from being perfect, even though it's a great romance, I have a lot of compliments for it. I like the main character. I like the relationship dynamic. I like that it wasn't dual POV. I kind of liked the back and forth at times, even though it kept cutting off the momentum. But what kind of kept it from being like a perfect book for me is that I had really high expectations going in, that I know people love and worship the ground that Emily Henry writes on so much, and that these are like peak romance books to some people. It felt like a romance book. It felt like a very standard romance book. It didn't feel like something that these characters are going to stick with me forever. It didn't really feel like that. Maybe when I watch the movie, I'll be able to associate with those actors that I love with those characters, and maybe it'll stick with me more. But overall, it wasn't like show-stopping, perfect, fantastic. I'm going to give Emily Henry more shots because she's one of my best friend's favorite romance authors. And my best friend's favorite book is, I think, Book Lovers by her. So that might be the one I try next to see if it hits. But I wouldn't say no to Emily Henry. It's annoying to get a hold of her books because there's such long lines at every single library for them. So I feel like if I'm spending that long waiting for a book, then I'm expecting it to be worth the wait. And this one was just okay overall, I will say. I do think that the constant time jumps were just a bit much. I would have preferred like maybe 2 or 3 chapters hung together, maybe a couple of flashback chapters, but the constant back and forth really cuts off her own momentum, so you can't really get into it in the same way, which was probably my biggest problem with it. Then the second romance book I read this month, about mid-month, was Say You'll Be Mine by Naina Kumar. I read the whole thing. I didn't have to read the whole thing. I read the whole thing. Otherwise, I had some pretty big issues with this romance book. I do think it was a silly, fun, goofy time. So if a silly, fun, goofy time is your thing, read this book. Now onto my problems with it. First of all, I should have known because Colleen Hoover is blurbed on the cover. I should have known that it wouldn't be for me. But it was just such a shame because I really like the characters and the setup and the individual characters' stories and their lives and the journeys they're going through. The main character, she is like in love with her ex-boyfriend who doesn't really even see her as an ex-girlfriend, doesn't even respect her enough to see her as an ex. And the love interest is living in New York and has this really, really rocky relationship with his father that's kind of keeping him from pursuing his dreams as a result. And their individual stories in the book are great and really interesting, and I like them, and I like their families and their dynamic with their friends and family. The romance just didn't work for me. He lives in New York, and she lives in Dallas, and they're constantly flying back and forth. It's like, how rich are these people? There's a scene that drove me nuts. They fly to Miami, right, for a bachelor party. Not weird. They're only there for about 12 hours. They land in the afternoon, spend the afternoon at the beach, go out to a bar, drink until probably 11 p.m., 12 p.m., like not even like a crazy binger night, just like they just have a night out, They go back to their hotel rooms. The next morning they fly home. Who can afford that? Who would do that? Like, don't you have bars where you're from? Like, why? If you're just gonna sit on a beach and go to a bar, why do you have to fly all the way to Miami for that? That was the moment I knew that realism wasn't a part of this book. But yeah, overall, the romance was super insta-lovey. I ended up giving this 2.5 stars because their dynamic just didn't work for me. They were just attracted to each other, like sexually. The male love interest was super cold and closed off and rude. And because it's dual POV, we can see he doesn't mean to be that way, but he is. And then they both kind of realize they're in love with each other 40% of the way through this book. And then we have to read the last 60% of them just failing to communicate that fact to each other. It was the most frustrating thing ever. At some point, like, I was enjoying it up to the 40% mark, and then they just could not tell each other that they liked each other. I'm like, you guys are in a fake relationship. This is perfect. Just say to the other person, I think I may be catching real feelings here. I don't know. Just like the lack of communication was driving me up the wall. Two of the worst communicators romantically on the planet, which is bad writing because they're great communicators with their families and other people in their life, just not each other. That's all I'll say there. There have been a string of bad books in a row there, or books I've been like semi-hating, semi-enjoying. Rest assured, the rest of the video has some bangers. Starting off with the last romance book I read, which was Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. This is a romantasy book. It is a sequel to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Super famous, well-known romantasies. I see them all over BookTube. I was kind of not expecting much going into this series because it comes so highly recommended, and that's always a risk. But it really was not what I was expecting. It's way more fantasy than romance. It's technically romantasy, but especially in book one, far less romance. It's much more about like fairies and the fairy world and this incredible world building of like, early 1900s Oxford professor studying fairies in a world in which fairies are known to people and dryadology is a thing that people study, the study of dryads. And I just love that world building. It's so sweet. And I remember when I read Encyclopedia of Fairies, I was like, this is too many good books in a row. I can't possibly be 5 stars. But now, reading the second book in a string of bad books in a row, and this one was still 5 stars. Oh yeah, I can say that. I rated this book 5 stars. I will definitely say that this series is going to be one of my faves. I'm definitely going to reread them. They're so sweet, and I love them. And I love Emily, the main character. She's so relatable. She's so socially awkward. And the second book just continues on the greatness that is the first book with like amazing new side characters that I was like slightly worried about like how they would add to the dynamic, but they blended in so well. One of the new side characters, Rose, I thought was going to be like the antagonist of the story, and I was like, okay, here we go, this annoying guy. But he ends up being just as socially awkward as Emily, and the two of them really bond over that, and he becomes like a mentor figure for her. I loved that. I love that so much. Emily becomes both mentor and mentoree in this book, where she takes over mentorship for her niece, Ariadne, and becomes a mentoree of this older professor, Professor Rose. Just loved both of those dynamics, and the relationship still is great. It's understated, it's subtly romantic, it's understood by the characters and sort of left to chance by the reader. And I also love the way that these books are kind of written without telling the reader everything. Like, things are a mystery to us, which allows the characters to be incredibly smart because they sort of form connections off the page, which works because it's written as a journal format. It's written as Emily's journal. So she doesn't always write down all the thoughts and opinions she has or the thoughts and opinions that other characters have. And therefore we keep getting surprised by all these exciting things happening that she has had sort of ideas about, but usually she'll just note down like, I have some thoughts here, but I'll get back to it later. And then we get back to it and it's such a surprise to the reader, and it really reinforces how intelligent Emily, the main character, is. Love her, love the story. Love these books so far. So excited for book 3 coming out next spring. And they're also such wintry books. So this is like the perfect season to read them in. I have been talking so much about these books, but the rest of them will go pretty quickly, I promise. That was the bulk of books that, if you're familiar with my channel, I haven't talked about in other places on this channel. So that's why I wanted to go into a ton more detail. This next category is a couple of rereads I did this month. This was kind of a rereading month for me, especially in the beginning of the month. Because one, I really wanted to reread one of these books. And then the other 2 rereads were the first 2 books in a series that I was prepping, you know, if you watched my last vlog. I was prepping for book 3 in that series, so I reread the first 2 books. The first reread I did from the stack was of one of my favorite book series of all time, if not my favorite, Gideon the Ninth of the Locked Tomb series. When I originally read this series, I read them on my Kindle. I still like them a lot on my Kindle, obviously, but I really wanted my own copies of these. I think they're so beautiful and the art is so good, and I wanted to annotate as well. I annotated this book for character deaths on the top, and then orange for relationship moments with the main relationship of this book between Gideon and Harrow. And then I annotated with black tabs for things that are referencing stuff that'll come up in the future books. So that's what I do for my rereads, is I like, especially for a series like this, I like catching references to stuff that's going forward, because Tamsyn Muir, next level genius of sci-fi. This book series should be known outside of just like, oh, it's queer sci-fi. It should be known as just peak sci-fi, as just incredible sci-fi writing, because she is planting all of these seeds. She has this insane, massive world building that really is not even fully explained yet, because book 4 isn't coming out yet. Electo, please come out next year. Book 4 isn't out yet, so we don't even know the whole extent of it, but you can already see that she's laid the groundwork, even in the books where she doesn't explain stuff as well. There are hints there if you catch them, and that's why I think this series is even better on a reread. And I give this book 5 stars the first time. I would give it like 10 stars out of 5 if I could. A bajillion stars out of 5 on this rating. I love these books. I'm so excited to start my reread of Harrow, because that was a book that I didn't fully enjoy on my first read, and I'm just getting the feeling that I might have to change that rating I gave it. I gave it 4 stars, and it might become a 5-star, just because I think I'm gonna understand a lot better what's going on in that book. They're confusing books to read for sure, but if you read them once, it only goes up from there, because then you can read them again and again and again, and you keep discovering more stuff. And I feel like I could definitely reread this again and annotate it for even more stuff. I haven't talked a ton about what this is about, but my pitch is necromancers in space in a futuristic solar system created by like God, their version of God, who, oh, I don't want to spoil things, but he was the original necromancer and he created all of this, and now he wants new assistants, new lectors to work for him, and our main characters are going to go see if they are worthy. And then the story just progresses from there. No spoilers, because the peak of this book is not knowing what's coming next, but you should absolutely read if you have not. That was a great reread. I'm so happy about that. Then my next reread is a book I don't currently have with me. It's for this series, for the Burning Kingdom series. I read the first book in it, The Jasmine Throne. I do have that book. I just left it with my stuff in DC because I read it. I didn't need to bring it with me. The Jasmine Throne is the setup book for the series. Won't talk about it a ton because I did a whole vlog breaking down the world building of this series and breaking down the main characters and their relationships and their powers and everything. I will say the first book I gave 5 stars the first time I read it, and on the reread, it's just incredible. So good. Great setup of the characters, some great twists, but mostly just like incredible foundational building of the story and an amazing romance at the center of it that is like my romantasy love. I always say that none of my favorite relationships in books are in romance. They're all in other genres because I think other genres do it better. But The Jasmine Throne is 5 stars. Then I read the second book in that series, The Oleander Sword, which continues the plot of the series, obviously. But this book I actually gave 4 stars. Still loved it. It has its place. I just tend to find if a series is going to be very good, then it's going to have a killer hook, a first book. It's going to have a lull in the second book where you're setting up for that final installment. So I'm fine with this being a 4-star because that led to The Lotus Empire being a 5-star. But I'll get into that in a second. I think what made this book just a little bit like less perfect than the other books is it's very heavy on the political intrigue all of a sudden. And I like political intrigue, but it's a very sudden switch from the Jasmine Throne that is way more centered around like an escape plot and thwarting evil and overcoming an oppressive force and all of these things, versus book 2 is suddenly Malini is deep in the political intrigue that she's so great at that she couldn't do in book 1, but it suddenly is like just a weight on the series a little bit, and it definitely takes a little bit of getting used to for someone like me that prefers a fantasy focused, like a fantasy adventure focused story over a fantasy political intrigue story. Don't mind a political intrigue story, but I just had to know going in. So I think this book is still, it was 4 stars originally, 4 stars in the reread. Still love it. And it got me so hype for the last book, but I did have my issues with it. The last category I've separated out is books I have read for reading vlogs I did, and books I just finished reading for reading vlogs I'm still in the middle of. So I don't want to spoil those reading vlogs, and I don't want to talk too much about books I've already talked a ton about. So I'm going to really, really try to keep this brief, but if you know me, kind of bad at keeping things brief, so we try for the best. The first book in that category is the third book in the series I was just talking about, The Burning Kingdoms. I read the new release of The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri. So good. A perfect ending for these characters. A lot of heavy political intrigue in the first half, but I like political intrigue when it builds up to an epic battle. So I ended up giving this book 5 stars because it was a perfect ending for these characters that I'm so in love with, and it had a great arc overall, and it wrapped up all the side characters really nicely. Oh, especially in this book, one of the side characters, Rao, is dealing with his heartbreak over a person he didn't even realize he was in love with, and his story in this book is so emotional and so good, and it really stole the show a little bit. Priya and Malini were still the show, but Rao definitely became like the #1 side character, and his story and his like emotional journey like just meant the world for me. And his bond with Seema, both of them bonding over like their respective sexualities and like becoming like best friends and taking care of each other. Love them. Love this. Love the side characters in this, especially much stronger side character stories than in the second book. I will say that's probably also what bumped up the star rating. But yeah, overall, had a great time. Watch that reading vlog if you want to know more. In that reading vlog, I then read also A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. I liked this. I had my issues with it. I detailed in that reading vlog. This is a sci-fi series set in a futuristic galaxy where there is an empire called Texkalon that rules over about 1/4 of the known world, which is a lot of planets and space stations. The main character, Mahit, is from a very small space station of about 30,000 people, where she is being sent as a diplomat to the Empire to 1, investigate her predecessor's murder, 2, prevent the Empire from absorbing her space station, as they are known to do, and 3, stay alive as long as possible. And it goes about as well as you could expect. I had my complaints with this, mostly that the first half was a lot of setup where the main character wasn't super involved in the setup, where she kind of like just was a witness to a lot of the world building that needed to take place. But I loved the second half, loved the ending, and I learned to love the side characters a lot, and I liked the main romance as well. I also just think these books have great messaging about empire absorption and the complicated feelings you can have, especially when you have a nation like Texkalon, an empire like Texkalon, that is good to its people. It is like not oppressing anyone within its empire. It just keeps growing and absorbing more countries, and assuming that every country should want to join their empire because their culture is so rich and they have such poetry and such a beautiful culture, but they're very disrespectful of other people's cultures. So I like that dynamic a lot in this book, and I was hoping to see it continue in the next book in the series, A Desolation Called Peace, which it did. And I can go into this with a little bit more depth because I didn't end up talking about this a ton in that reading vlog, but I loved this book. This was 5 stars for me, where A Memory Called Empire is 4 stars. This was 5 stars. Such an incredible plot. As opposed to the first book, which was only from Mahit's perspective, this book was from multiple perspectives, and all of them were so interesting and written so differently depending on the characters, and they're all very unique characters with very unique ways of thinking that I loved. I loved getting inside the head of a Texkalonly citizen, the citizen of the Empire, compared to Mahit, because they just think so differently. Also, a medical procedure that Mahit gets done at the end of the first book, no spoilers, dramatically changes her character, not dramatically, changes her character somewhat, makes her more active, makes her know more about what's going on and feel more confident in her own abilities. And that makes her also a better, more compelling character in here. This is such a good follow-up. You should absolutely read the first book just so you can read this book. In this book is mostly focused about making first contact with a group of aliens that don't communicate like any of the humanoid species that the Empire is currently aware of that is attacking the Empire. And Mahit and her companion, Three Seagrass, get pulled into that to try to understand their language and try to understand these creatures. And that understanding does involve fungal networks, and I love a fungal network, especially in sci-fi. Love a fungal network. So cool, great concept. Read this series. Amazing main relationships. The side characters in here that also we get more depth of perspectives from. 8 Antidote and 9 Hibiscus, they have sci-fi names, bear with me, are both so good. Loved 8 Antidote in this book. But he's only 11 years old, but he's primed to be the next emperor. And the thought process this kid is having, he's clearly still a child. He's written as a child with a human brain at 11 years old development, but he's also clearly had so much information stuffed in his head his entire life that he has so much knowledge, way more knowledge than an 11-year-old should have, but the ability to comprehend it is at an 11-year-old's level. I just think he's so well written as a character. And 9 Hibiscus is also a well-written character. Love her dynamic with everybody. Loved this book. Such a slay. What an absolute win. I liked the first book too. Liked the first book. Loved the second book. Really nailed the ending. And then the last 2 books I want to talk about are both in vlogs that I haven't released yet, that I'm still working on, so I don't want to go into a ton of depth about them. But I read The Nightmare Before Kissmas, which is definitely more of a December read, and I was thinking about saving it for my December wrap-up, but I read it, I finished it on Thanksgiving. So it belongs in the November reading wrap-up, unfortunately. This was a great rom-com, had a really fun time with it, enjoyed it, laughed a ton, rooted for the main character. I think I ended up giving this 4 stars, just because I got a little bit annoyed with the side characters that we were supposed to love acting like assholes, and I could have used more character development from the love interest. Those are nitpicks, kind of, but nitpicks and romances stick with me because I'm already like questioning. I'm like, this is so unrealistic. It's a romance, so I'm already like looking for nitpicks. So I can't help it. It's just how I am. I love a romance. Love reading a romance. I read a ton of them, but I am picky about them, and I tend to rate them lower because I have high standards for love. Because books like these set my standards for love. All 5 of these books, all 5 of my sci-fi fantasy books this month set my standards for love. So romances have a tough time following up. But I definitely still enjoyed it. Definitely still recommend it. Especially if you're in the mood for a holiday rom-com, this is one you should pick up. It has great Christmas vibes. Talks a lot about like Christmas decor and wintry vibes and all of that, which I think is so fun. Love. And then the last book I read this month was just a little book for another vlog. And if you can guess what that vlog is going to be about, you might be a wizard. Because that is The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum. I've never really read this story or watched any sort of Wizard of Oz movies. I just kind of know what is in the public zeitgeist about this story. And I was shocked when I was watching the movie for this book because I knew all of the songs and I was like, I've never watched this movie, but I just knew all the songs because they're so iconic. And the book was also very iconic. I loved it a ton. It was really, really sweet. It had a great storytelling because it is like a children's fantasy story from the 1900s. From the year 1900, I think it was published. So it had a very like simplistic messaging. It's very much like good begets good. The bad guy will always lose if the good guy is kind of heart and stuff like that, which I think is sweet in children's fantasy and I like, and I had a good time with it. And I ended up giving it 4 stars because it's not like the most complex story on earth. It didn't have me like spinning in my seat, but it did what it wanted to do. It's a great children's fantasy. I would definitely recommend this for kids, for your kids or for kids in your life. Because I thought the story was really sweet and the characters were really nice. Especially because my only understanding of like her sidekicks, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, are these like caricatures. And in the book, they're like very wholesome, sweet characters that I actually really loved in the book and cared about a lot. So yeah, had a good time with it, but I won't spoil more because I talk about it more in that vlog when it comes out. But yeah, overall, those were all the books that I read in November. I talked for quite a while. there were fewer books, so I could talk for more about all of them, which is what I will do. If you stuck around to the end of this video, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate people that watch the whole thing or find me interesting enough and find my voice like tolerable enough to watch the entire videos. I appreciate that. And I hope you had a great November. I hope you had a great reading month. Feel free to talk about any books you read and loved in November in the comments below, or if you read any of the books that I read and you loved them as well and you want to chat, always feel free to comment. I'm around. But yeah, I will leave it there. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye.